Hello and welcome back to week 5 for CJ 450. We are now in the third and final discussion on manifestations of terrorism. And this time we're going to cover emerging environments in the world of terrorism, specifically transnational or international terrorism and criminal enterprises which carry out acts of terrorism in pursuit of their particular goals. As always, here are the learning objectives for this particular week. You can see here there are 3. We're going to understand how and why terrorists construct global networks now in order to pursue their goals, where traditionally, generations ago, centuries ago, they did not necessarily do this. We're going to distinguish some of the emerging terrorist environments where violence is directed specifically against a particular gender, or a particular race, or a particular culture. And we're also going to take a look at some of these criminal enterprises and see how they are carrying out acts of terrorism either in pursuit of profit or a combination of profit and political power. And you're going to end this particular week not only with a discussion on how women and children get caught up into carrying out terrorism, but also you're going to analyze a current case study on narco-terrorism in the state of Mexico. Here are your reading and your media requirements for this particular week. You're going to read Martin chapters 8 and 9. And then you're going to read an article which is very interesting, came out in 2017 on the next generation narco-terrorist. Many of you probably are aware that El Chapo has been in custody for really quite some time now. This particular article is highlighting that although a bad guy like El Chapo is now off the street, so to speak, the next generation narco-terrorist is just around the corner. Very interesting article, and that's going to form the focus of your assignment. Okay, so we're going to go over some new definitions, which continues to build on what you know. You recall way back in week 1, we discussed the basic definitions of terrorism and terrorism in general, and we've worked our way through the theories that create terrorists into the motivations such as state-sponsored or dissident, further into ideological and religious, and now we're moving into what is international terrorism. I'll let you read that here for a second, and I just want to highlight a couple of key points that are out of this. International terrorism is terrorism, so you can start with the week 1 definition, but it specifically targets an international symbol so that there is an effect that goes far beyond the locale of where those terrorists happen to be. And a very easy example is something like the Hezbollah terrorist group in Lebanon in the 1980s, which was a participant within the Lebanese Civil War at the time. And the United States had led an international coalition, an international effort to step in and stop the fighting. And they landed U.S. Marines in 1982. And in 1983, Hezbollah sponsored an attack on the Marine barracks, exploding it for a whole host of reasons. And over 280 Marines lost their lives. Now, this is targeting an international symbol that transcends the Lebanese Civil War. It turns what is a regional civil war conflict where the international community is stepping in to try to alleviate some of the suffering and stop the fighting, and it creates an immediate international crisis. This is a textbook example of international terrorism, targeting an international symbol. Note that Hezbollah is a dissident group, okay, and that's what this is also part of this particular definition. So again, international terrorism starts with the basic generic general terrorist definition which you learned in week 1, but now we are narrowing it that says this is a group that is a domestic terrorism. They could be a dissident, they could be state-sponsored, it could be ideological, they could be religious, it doesn't matter, but because they are targeting an international symbol or they are looking for an effect that transcends their local political environment, this becomes by definition an international terrorist event. Now note the last sentence. International terrorism, by definition, doesn't require any of these terrorists to actually leave their home country. Okay? This is why Al-Qaeda can be involved in domestic terrorism within Saudi Arabia, domestic terrorism within Afghanistan, and also international terrorism because they sponsor or they have solidarity with lone wolves or local cells as far away as Europe or the United States. They didn't even have to leave their home country, and yet they are inspiring terrorism in California. This is international terrorism. So what is narco-terrorism? Well, narco-terrorism is something that is a little bit different. It sort of branches off of domestic and international terrorism because narco-terrorism is the illicit dealings in criminal activity where profit is generated, okay? So you have profit-oriented enterprises which may commit terrorist acts in order to maximize their particular profit or their power hold over a profit industry, such as drugs or other illicit traffic, human trafficking, anything that is criminal of nature where they can maximize their particular profit. They may commit terrorist acts in support of that profit. Now, the difference is whereas an international symbol seeks to maximize exposure, their particular terrorist acts may be more focused because they don't want international attention. They're simply sending a message to a particular target or an audience. So in blue now, we've moved to criminal political enterprises because they may be more willing to terrorize others due to their dissident nature of their goals. And a good example of this is FARC in Colombia. This is a dissident group that earns their money and earns their resources through illicit traffic of drugs and human trafficking. But they have political goals, and so they combine the criminal enterprise and their political enterprise into a criminal political enterprise, which now is willing to terrorize others because there is both a profit orientation and there is also a dissident orientation. So you want to be able to differentiate between the two when we're talking about narco-terrorism. Is it simply profit-oriented with a little bit of power politics on the side, or is this really a political venture that is heavily involved in criminal activity in order to sponsor or resource their particular political enterprise? We're going to take a look at that. Let's put this all up on one particular board. And again, I like to build this course from week 1 all the way through. There shouldn't be any leftover parts here. Everything that we have studied from week 1 forward should still be relevant towards getting towards international terrorism. As an example, we start way up here with theories of cause, rational choice, socialization, moralization. Those are the 3 basic theories which you learned in weeks 1 and 2. We went into our basic manifestation of state-sponsored dissident terrorism. Again, that analogy of rebel alliance versus the empire, it forms the basis of that basic manifestation of what type of terrorist are we talking about. Further into a next manifestation, which was week 4, last week, where we talk about ideological motivations or religious motivations. Now, state-sponsored terrorism can be ideologically motivated. Dissident terrorism can be ideological motivated. They both can seek their motivation from religious means or ideological means. So now let's go to the final manifestation to show the true complexity of terrorism. And we see that much of this is domestic terrorism, but here we're going to talk about how a lot of this can be international terrorism. And how do we know, how do we diagnose international terrorism? Well, we talked already that there's an international symbolism. There are international consequences behind the attack. Often you will see it as a revolution against a particular ism, okay? Zionism, for example, or Marxism, or capitalism, or some other sort of ism where a particular group, a dissident group, or even a state-sponsored group is seeking a revolution against a particular ism. There's often a global solidarity between a particular state-sponsored group or a dissident group which has an ideological or religious motivation, yet they have a global solidarity with other similarly minded groups elsewhere within the international community. And of course, stateless terrorism is something that we've been grappling with heavily for the last 15 years or so, whether it's Al-Qaeda, which doesn't seek a state of its own, okay? Or an ISIS, which is a stateless terrorist group that does seek a particular state of its own, and of course is now without either a state or a stateless terrorism because they've been essentially defeated in Syria. So now we also move into the gray area, which you see down here in the bottom of the circle, narco-terrorism, which illicit traffic and criminal enterprises can feed either domestic terrorism or international terrorism, or both. And we see the two basic categorizations of this: traditional criminal enterprises, mostly profit-oriented, trying to stay out of the limelight, and criminal political enterprises, which have no problem carrying out acts of terror, both for profit and for international notoriety. So you want to step back and take a look at, see how this all relates to itself from the theories down through the manifestations towards this triangle of domestic, international, and narco-terrorism, and how a particular group can be working in all three of those boxes at the same time in pursuit of their particular goals. Okay, so let's finish up this particular week going back towards the beginning of Chapter 9, where we're going to talk about terrorism against gender, race, or culture. Now, we've covered ethnic cleansing already in a previous week, so we're going to continue that conversation because this is an emerging environment today as the globe or the international community becomes more and more connected through technology, and more international terrorists can express their solidarity behind the evil of a particular ism from their particular perspective. And we begin to see terrorism against gender, race, and culture done on an international scale outside a particular region. So you can see right here that it starts with state-sponsored repression of a particular race or gender or culture, typically to solidify a political power base. It can quickly move towards state-sponsored ethnic cleansing, which you have already seen in the example of the collapse of Yugoslavia, and we see throughout the world today. Anarchy or lawlessness in a particular region induces terrorism against gender, race, and culture. Somalia being a pretty good example. The lawlessness in Libya or Yemen, for example. Many different bad spots around the world where the lack of government, the lack of state sponsorship or control leads to anarchy, and anarchy often takes out or uses acts of terror against those that are the least able to resist, such as women and children, for example, or a particular race that has no power base whatsoever, or a culture that has traditionally been one that has been repressed. Now, all of this can lead or result to a genocide. And again, these are justified by politics, ideology, and religion. So what does this mean for us as counterterrorism? Well, number one, and I put it in red because it's that important, it has significant international consequences. Widespread destruction, starvation, and disease. It creates wars. It leads to mass migration. And if the international community is unwilling or unable to resolve, well, then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And the reason the international community is often reluctant to get involved is because it requires military force, and few countries, the United States included, is willing to sacrifice lives and resources in another country's affairs. So this is one of those key points that we want to be able to examine this particular week because it represents an emerging environment of terrorism where violence is specifically targeted against a gender, race, or culture. All right, as you know, here are your week 5 assignments. You see the discussion. We're going to talk about non-warrior stereotypes, women and children terrorists. Review table 3.1 from the Martin text, and then read the 4 articles from the blackboard. And then your week 5 case study number 3, we're going to look at narco-terrorism 2018. You can read the article, talk about the next generation narco, use the Martin textbook chapter 9 to help you classify the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and then discuss your perspectives on how and why the Mexican and U.S. governments are involved with the CJNC. Again, no additional references are required unless you want to bring it in as you wish. Keep it to 2 pages. 3 is probably too long. 1 is definitely too short. APA format, Grantham paper standards. And with that, I will see you on the other side for week 6. So good luck on week 5.